learn how you can create your very own adjustable background blur lens. Alright, so I'm just here in Lens Studio with a default blank project, and let's get started with our adjustable background blur. So let's start with the blur. So let's go to our objects panel, post effects, and I want the Gaussian blur, which will give us a nice even blur. And now you can see that the entire image is blurred, but we want just the background. So what we need is a segmentation texture and the portrait background. And so what this will let us do is it will separate the background from the person. Alright, so to apply that, I'm going to create a screen image, and that will create an orthographic camera for us. And on the screen image, I would like to have our device camera texture, just whatever the camera sees. And I'd like to use my segmentation texture to then mask that. So I want the person to be whatever the camera's seeing, and then I want the blurred part to come through on the background. But our default image material doesn't let us add a mask or an opacity texture. So we need to create an unlit material. I'm just going to drag that over here for now. So by default, it just has this white texture. So let's come back to our material settings. I'm going to swap that white texture out for the device camera texture and turn on opacity texture. But there's no option to select a texture. That's because our blend mode is disabled. Set that to normal. Now I can choose my segmentation. So the segmentation is working, except it's making me blurry, not the background. So all I have to do is come to the background segmentation and invert mask. And now you can see our background is blurred. And then our stretch modes, we have it to fit. I just like to put it to stretch just to make sure it fills. It should always do it, but I just like to do that. All right, so we have our blur, and we can adjust it here. So I can have no blur, I can have a lot of blur. But we want the user to be able to change that. So what we're going to do is we're going to import the UI widgets from Lens Studio. So if we come to the Lens Studio website, they have a color picker and slider we can use. And so this is on their user interface page. So if we come to the Lens Studio website, we can search for user interface. It's under their guides, scripting, helper scripts, user interface. And we can click here to download the UI system. This will download a zip file, and it will have all the buttons and slider in there. So download the file, unzip it, and then in Lens Studio, we're going to come into the resources panel. We're going to import from files, and we're going to choose that .lso file that we unzipped. So we're going to open that up. So we'll get a new folder of some stuff down here, some scripts, some textures, and then we'll get this place under orthographic camera thing up here. So if we open this up, now we have a UI panel with buttons and the color picker and the hint, but we don't see anything here. And that's because it wants us to move it under an orthographic camera. Now, I'm not going to move it under this orthographic camera because I want to set up a separate live target and capture target. So if I click on the device here in the preview panel, we have a live camera and a capture mode. So the live target is going to be what we see in the live camera. It's what the person sees as they're taking a snap. If I switch to capture mode, this will be what the user sees after they capture the snap. And so what we can do is we can construct our user interface on the live target and hide it from the capture target so that while I'm taking the snap, I can see the slider and adjust the background blur. But once I've taken it, I'm not going to have a slider just kind of overlaid over everything. So to do that, I need to create a separate render target. So let's go ahead and do that now. So in the resources panel, I'm going to call this UI target. And I'm going to come to the scene config, and for the live target, I'll have that be my UI target, and everything else will be the render target still. Alright, so we aren't seeing really anything going on yet, and that's because we need a new camera. So let's add a camera. Now let's go ahead and put it on the orthographic layer for now. Turn off the default layer, change this to an orthographic camera. So now we can see a UI here. Now we also want to set the render target to the UI target. And let's go ahead and drag our widgets underneath. And now everything should be laid out, and we can click on the buttons and use the slider. So if I come over here, I switch to our capture mode, you can see the widgets disappear. If I come back to the live camera, they are back. Now, before we move on, I'm going to take my Gaussian blur, I'm going to bump it up all the way. And now, if I go to the capture mode, we have a really nice blurry background, but we lost that in our live camera. So what we need to do is come to our UI camera. So let's rename that really quick. And we want to essentially just overlay this on everything else going on. Let's go into the render target. So I'm going to come to the clear color option, which with none, it's essentially just reading in the what the camera sees. So I'm going to change that to texture. And for the input, select the render target. And now you can see our blurred background. And if I switch between the capture mode and the live mode, you can see that we still have our blurry background with our user interface over top in the live mode. All right, so let's delete these buttons and toggles. I'm going to go ahead and delete the hint. We just want our slider. So let's just expand this out to see what's going on. We have a few extra items, namely these colors. We aren't adjusting colors, so let's remove all that stuff. So the pop-up, so when I click and drag, there's this pop-up off to the side. That's because my finger normally would be covering that cursor. So we don't need the pop-up. I'm just going to disable it. If we come look at the cursor, which is the little circle that the user drags on the slider, there's a background, which is just a circle, and the color visual, which shows the current color. We don't need that current color, so I'll disable it. And now if I'm looking at the rest of it, we have this background image, which is this kind of really long oval shape. Then the palette, which has the actual colors. Now we don't need the palette. If I disable that, we lose the cursor. So all we need to do is just click on the cursor and drag it out to the background, and we have our slider back. Now these elements that we disabled, some of them we can delete, but the UI color picker script here that kind of controls everything is looking for certain elements to be there. So it won't, so some things if you delete them you'll get warnings, some things you'll actually get an error on the script. So I'm just going to leave them disabled rather than delete them. But we have our slider here and it is outputting values. We just aren't using them yet. So one thing you might want to do is you can change the images you're using here. So I'm just going to leave the circle, but I'm going to go ahead and change this slider background. So for any texture or anything you have in here, so if I open up color picker and I go to the color picker background, here's a preview. You can open it in an external editor directly if you have it set up on your system. And if you've saved your project, so if it doesn't say untitled up in the top left, you'll have a show and explorer button. This will open up the file in your file explorer. So you can use this to open as reference in your graphics editor. So I've already gone ahead and done that. So I just created a triangular scale. So open that up. So it's just a triangle. So the slider at the bottom is value of 0, up at the top it's value of 1. So I have this triangle to kind of imply that. So on my background, I'm just going to swap that out. And now I've customized the look and feel of the slider. It's really easy. We don't need to make many changes at all, if any, to use this. Okay, so we have our slider. Now we just need to connect it to our blur factor on our material. Now there isn't necessarily a straightforward way to do this, so we're going to have to use a little script, but it is not very complex. It's pretty short and simple. So I'm going to add a new script. Let's rename this blur strength. Let's open this in the built-in editor. I'm just going to copy the script I wrote and paste it. And let's go over this. Alright, so the first thing we're doing is we're importing a script component. And so if we come back to the widgets page and scroll down to the slider, we can see that Snapchat's added a couple callbacks. And so a callback is just the script, anytime there's a change, it's going to run a function, and we can tell it which function to run. Our function is going to be the callback. So when the callback gets called, it's going to run whatever we want. So on slider value changed, we can attach one of our own functions to that. So as the slider is moving, it will be telling us the new value, and then we can use that value to set the strength of our blur. And so that's why we're importing a script component. We need our material, of course, to affect that strength. And then I have the multiplier. So our slider goes from 0 to 1, but if we come back to our blur, a blur value of 1 is really subtle. And so we might want to go up to like 3, 4, or even 5. So I'm just going to multiply the slider value by a number like 5. So if I multiply it by 5, my scale is now 0 to 5 rather than 0 to 1. Then the initial value is when the lens turns on. I just want to set the slider at some value and make sure that the blur corresponds and matches that value, so that there isn't like a jump when I start using the slider. So that's what those values are for. So I have this change blur function. So this is what we're going to add to the callback. So when the slider changes, we'll call this function. We're going to take our blur material, and then what we're doing is we're accessing the main pass of the material. So over here, you can think of the main pass as just like all the parameters here. So we have the screen texture, the blur factor, and we aren't using the opacity. And the value we want to change is blur factor. Now you can get this value by hovering your mouse over any of these parameters here. So this is blur factor, all one word, no spaces, all lowercase except for the F is capitalized. It is case sensitive. If we wanted to change our input texture here, it would be .mainPass.screen texture. And so that's where this blur factor comes from. Now I'm going to take the color picker script, and then we use .api to access its properties. And it has a function called add callback. And so we're going to grab the on slider value changed, attach our change blur function. So now in the color picker script, it now is going to be able to use our change blur function. Essentially is what's going on. So as the slider value changes, it'll give the value to change blur, and it'll set our blur strength. So it'll be the value from the slider multiplied by our multiplier. And then these last two lines are just for kind of initializing things. So when our lens turns on, we'll take our initial value, set the slider to it, and also set our blur strength to that. So nothing too complicated. It's just kind of going through a checklist of what needs to happen and when. So let's just add an empty object here, and we'll add a script. I want this blur strength script. All right. Let's go ahead and rename this blur controller. Now, since we're accessing the color picker script, which is going to be on the UI color picker, I'm just going to keep my blur controller at the bottom because we need to make sure that the UI color picker script is run first. So don't move this up to the top unless you maybe change this to lens turned on or something. So I'm just going to leave it at the bottom. So let's come into our UI cam. We don't want the panel script, we want the color picker script. We want our blur material. And now you can see our initial value is 0, so our slider is now at 0. And we don't see much blur going on because our multiplier is 0. We're always setting it to 0 blur. So let's put our multiplier to 5, our initial value to 0.5. Now you can see we start with some blur. We can increase, make that really strong, and we can also decrease it. So while the user is using Snapchat or recording, they can adjust that strength, and what they actually capture will just be the nice clean image with the blur, no slider. And that is that if all you want is just the blur. Now, you might be using this blurred background as part of another lens. So let's just go over a few quirks of adding like a post effect or something. So let's go ahead and add some grain just for fun. So I'm going to add a 2D animation from files. And I have a grain tutorial you can watch if you'd like to learn how to set this up. So I just have my sequence here. Let's just go and lower that. And I'm going to add a new screen image. So earlier, I mentioned we could put a mask on the camera itself. But if we had done that, we wouldn't be able to just create another screen image here to create our grain. So let's just put our animation there. Set it to stretch. And then for the images I have, it's just hard light. So there's a little bit of grain. Let's take the opacity down so it's more subtle. And let's just slow it down maybe just a little bit. Okay, so it's a nice subtle grain. You can see our blur is still working fine with it. And our grain is overlaid the blur so it doesn't get blurred out, which is, I think, the effect that we want. All right, so that was pretty straightforward. It's just adding a screen image. Let's say we want to add something like a color correction. So I'm going to come into here. Let's grab a color correction. And let's see, let's just grab blue and orange. Now, it by default added it to our initial camera. See, the background is blue and orange, but I'm not. So I'm going to drag this down, and I can stick it under the orthographic camera. Let's change that blend mode to orthographic layer, and let's bring the alpha down a little bit. So this looks fine. Let's check our capture mode, but now it looks a lot different. So what the user sees is not going to be what they're capturing. And so there are just a few kind of weird things with the post effects. So I'm going to drag this out from inside, from being nested. I'm just going to leave it here. So live camera capture mode is a little different. To be honest, I don't know exactly why it's going on. I think it has to do with what the post effect is using as input. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to disable that for now, but I don't want to delete the LUT that it imported. What I'm going to do is go to Post Effects, import a color correction. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to drag it down here. I'm going to put on the orthographic layer because we have this stuff on our orthographic layer. Material color correction. For the lookup table, let's grab the blue orange, and the screen texture is kind of like the input. Let's just grab the render target. So we're very blue and orange. We'll fix that in just a minute. And so if we come back to live camera, we still have this really bad effect going on. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our UI camera. We're going to create a new layer. I'm going to add a new layer. I'm just going to call this UI. I want to take it off orthographic. And now you can see our widgets disappeared. So I'm just going to select everything. So I'll click the top item, hold shift, click the bottom. I want to move that all to the UI layer. And make sure you get your icon as well. Or I guess I completely missed it. Yeah, so expand everything out before you start selecting. It doesn't automatically grab all the children. Okay, so we have our slider. The blur is still adjusting. We're now on the new layer, the UI camera, and it's widgets. Now if I switch between live and capture mode, now our post effect looks the same between the two. So I don't know exactly why that's going on, but putting your UI render target items on a new layer seems to help. And even if we go back to our original post effect, that one would also work just fine. So I don't know why I went over this color correction. I think earlier when I was playing around with it, that's how I solved it. So you can just stick with the default, I guess. Ignore everything I just taught you. But if you do want to use this one, you can do that. Okay, so let me just double check. Okay, yeah, so everything's working. So we can adjust that blur strength still. We can have a really extreme LUT effect, or we can make it a little more subtle. So it's still there. We have our grain kind of overlaid. We have our background blur. So this would probably be a good place to end it before I start spouting off more nonsense. So what we learned was we added a blur. We used the segmentation to mask it off. We set up a new render target for our live target versus a capture target, so that we can hide the slider when the snap is captured. And then we figured out how to put things on different layers so that we can use our post effects and we can add like grain overlays. So it might be a lot of stuff to keep straight. So if you're having issues, just double check what layer something is on, what render target, what camera you're in. And definitely make use of the live camera, capture camera. Always test it on your phone too. And also as a quick bonus, you can actually hide the Snapchat UI if you want like a more clear preview while you're working. You can show the regular UI, and they also have the sponsored UI. For capture mode, it doesn't matter. All it does is just says sponsored up here. It's the same as just the Snapchat UI, really. So yeah, hopefully you learned something and are not more confused than when you started watching this video. I know I am confused because I'm on version 3, actually 4, of trying to get this video made. Good luck. Not really though. It's not that hard. Just keeping layers and render targets straight.